through which students pursue a certificate in Judaic studies and a master's in social work. The program brings a really wide range of students who are interested in different aspects of Jewish communal life, from cultural to communal to religious to political and so on. And we have a really incredible set of students with diverse interests this year. So the Communal Conversation, which is happening right now, has been part of the Jewish Communal Leadership Program since 2011 when the program started. And each year, the second year cohort of students chooses a topic that's really important to them. And then they spend the year developing a program and a conversation to bring to our local Jewish community. One of the Zoom silver linings, of which there are very few, is that we've been able to bring this conversation to people beyond the local Southeast Michigan Jewish community. It's really, really great to see people joining us from across the country today, especially great to see some of our alums here. So thank you all for being here. So in addition to thanking you all for taking time out of your Sunday afternoon to join us, I want to thank all of our co-sponsors for helping to make this happen. And a special thank you to the School of Social Work and the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies for their continued support of JCLP. Thanks also to Paige Walker, who's JCLP's program coordinator and is really running a lot of the show behind the scenes. So thanks to Paige for all you've done to support students. And a huge thank you to our speakers for joining us all today. I'm really excited to learn from you all. Lastly, I wanted to just spend a moment appreciating the students who've put so much time and so much energy into making this event happen. So they've done a lot more than what I'm about to share with you, but I wanted to give you a small sense of the roles they've played. So Erica and Claire really conceptualized the format of today and worked with speakers to bring the speakers here to share their wisdom and expertise with you. Rachel and Ezra developed a budget. They found co-sponsors, they raised funds to make the event happen, and Ezra is doing a ton of the tech work. And Miriam, Moss, and Emily created publicity materials and advertised the event and reached out to newspapers and did a lot of work to really make sure that so many of you were able to join us today. So I wanted to just give you a little snippet of the work that all of the students have been doing and just spend a moment really appreciating them. So a quick little round of virtual applause for them. So thank you all for the work you've put into this. That's all from me. I'm going to turn it over to Claire, who will get the rest of the program started. Thank you again.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today at the Jewish Communal Leadership Program's annual Community Conversation, Climate Justice and the Jewish Community, a Call to Action Through Dialogue. Before we get started, we wanted to take a moment to introduce the second year students of JCLP who all contributed to organizing this event today. Ezra Brown, Miriam Chesterman, Emily Gordon, Moss Herberholtz, Erica Kuhn-Fink, Rachel Levy, and my name is Claire Lauer. And I'll provide a quick image description of myself as well. So I am a white woman with medium length, dark blonde hair. I am wearing glasses and I have a light green long sleeve shirt on today. This year, we decided to focus our conversation on environmentalism and climate justice in the Jewish community. Together as a cohort, we chose to highlight this conversation as a means of understanding the current landscape of climate justice work within the Jewish community. We welcome you to this conversation wherever you are on your journey with these topics. Today, we will be hearing from leaders with a wide range of perspectives and experiences regarding environmentalism and climate justice. We hope that this allows you to find an approach that resonates with you. We also hope that today's event will further the individual and communal work within the Jewish community of addressing the climate crisis. Joining us for today's conversation are Vicki Kaplan, the Director of Organizing at Dayenu, Kristy Drutman, the founder of Brown Girl Green, Sophia Rich, a National Leadership Board member of the Jewish Youth Climate Movement, Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein, a rabbinic scholar and public affairs advisor at Jewish Federations of North America, Rabbi Ellen Bernstein, an eco-theologian and spiritual leader, and Rabbi Dr. Ariel Mayse, an assistant professor of religious studies at Stanford University. The program for our event can be found in a PDF in the Zoom chat, and you should have also received it in your email along with the Zoom link for this event. In that program, we also have a resource list with upcoming actions for Passover and local and national opportunities to further your learning after today. By clicking on the PDF, you can view the event schedule as well as the full bios of each of our speakers. Throughout the event, we want to encourage all of you to take care of yourself as you need. Live transcripts will be available, and a short break is scheduled after our second conversation this afternoon. So we will begin with a conversation between Vicki Kaplan and Kristy Drutman, moderated by JCLP second year, Rachel Levy. Kristy Drutman is the founder of Brown Girl Green, a media platform exploring the intersections between media, diversity, and environmentalism. As a sustainability communications expert, Kristy is excited to speak with us about how to engage audiences about proactive solutions to the climate crisis. Vicki Kaplan is the Director of Organizing at Dayenu, a Jewish call to climate action. In the past, she has worked as a labor and human rights organizer in the Midwest and campaigned to protect water as a public resource. Vicki has overseen organizing programs, mobilizations, and election campaigns that engaged and developed the leadership of tens of thousands of activists. Please see their full bios in our PDF pamphlet. Vicki Kaplan and Kristy Drutman will share their thoughts, backgrounds, and current work in the climate justice movement. And now I'll pass the mic to you all.
All right, so I know now I'm pinned. Hi everyone, my name is Rachel Levy. I use she and her pronouns, and I'll provide a brief image description of myself and then introduce Vicki and Kristy to also give image descriptions of themselves as well. I am a white woman wearing a light purple turtleneck. My hair is pulled back into a low bun, and I'm wearing light blue bamboo hoop earrings. Vicki, could you please go first with an image description of yourself?
Yes, hi, my name is Vicki Kaplan. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a white woman with long brown hair, and I'm wearing a blue dress and a gold necklace.
And Kristy?
Hi there, my name's Kristy Drutman. I have light brown skin, short, black, brownish, curly hair, and I'm wearing a red top with purple and blue flowers.
Wonderful. So like Claire said in her introduction, and as we said through advertisements for this event and different conversations that we've had with community members, we're really hoping that this event is not a one-off, but more of a launch pad or reinvigoration process for folks to learn more, get back involved, get involved with a bunch of really amazing work done in the Jewish community towards environmental and climate justice. I am so fortunate to be with Kristy Drutman and Vicki Kaplan today. They're both incredible change makers that are doing great work on the ground, have really long resumes that we'll get to hear a little bit about during the rest of this dyad. But I'd like to start with a question that I hope can open up all of our minds to thinking about what does change look like and how might we start to find an entry point to this work. Change and working towards change, such a multifaceted process. And both of the speakers that I have with me today are engaged in change work on a variety of levels with a variety of different strategies. So Kristy, starting with you, could you please share some of the different ways that you have worked towards change and engaged in change work for climate justice?
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. In terms of my work on climate justice, a lot of my work surrounds storytelling, as well as an emphasis on diversity, justice, and inclusion in the climate space. For a long time, I come from both a Filipino and a Jewish background, and I felt like a lot of the voices from the identities that I come from weren't really well represented in the climate conversation. And I felt like it was leaving, large swaths of the population out of the climate conversation when it came to climate education and climate advocacy. And so I created Brown Girl Green when I was finishing university at UC Berkeley after many years of doing youth environmental advocacy work, both on campus and off campus. And for me, I just really wanted a space on the internet where I could be able to do environmental advocacy in real time that felt that it was both educating people about the science and the policy, but also interjecting, cultural nuance into that discussion, because I felt like if we're going to actually be able to bring climate advocacy into the mainstream and really get people to act, they need to feel like they can relate and connect to the material. And so for me, I was like, well, I don't want to just be this person that has, a climate science background or even an activist background. I want to be someone that people can relate to by infusing my own life journey and the ways in which I navigate this space. And so for me, the ways in which I view change happening is being able to be an advocate and a storyteller who is basically being able to use these platforms that are so powerful for entertainment and for people to really get information from these days in terms of current events, or even, knowing the latest trends or pop culture, but instead tapping into that to instead use it to inspire people on both an individual and systemic level that they can take action. And I feel like when it comes to thinking about the influence of the fossil fuel industry and a lot of other extractive industries and their influence on pop culture and media, I feel like there's not enough talk about how much that is being infiltrated right now, and the role of storytellers and the need for more storytellers who come from diverse backgrounds to basically challenge that rhetoric that, living with these extractive industries and living in, the current system we operate in is the inevitable. I believe that that's a story that we're trapped within. And I think, Brown Girl Green is an entity that exists to resist that, to challenge that, to bring in more voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, people who come from, people with disabilities, people from the Jewish community, and so forth, to be able to challenge that narrative and to bring more people in. So that's my approach to change with my platform, and I'm just happy to be here and to keep discussing this in today's chat.
Thank you so much, Kristy. And before I pass it over to Vicki to also answer the question, I'm wondering if you could talk just a little bit more about what you mean by platform and the different ways that Brown Girl Green kind of exists in different platforms.
Totally, yeah. So Brown Girl Green, it's a podcast, it's videos, it's graphics, it's a blog. I like to call it just a multimedia series because it's constantly evolving and involves a lot of different moving parts. I would say that it's a platform in the fact that, as much as it is me, a content creator putting out information, it's also that I'm plugging in resources, I'm plugging in organizations and companies that people might not know about. I think I view the work I do as a resource hub. So a lot of the work I do is like, hey, check out these resources, check out this action happening, or this community organization, the work they're doing. Because what I realized is that there's such amazing climate solution work happening, but a lot of that's not being broadcast online. A lot of people, unless you're in those very insular circles, know about it. And so for me, when I think about accessibility and inclusivity, I'm like, how can I create a space to make that easier for people? So that way this information isn't just locked in nonprofits. It's not just locked in academia, but I'm actually creating new avenues for conversation and resource exchange that we've never really had access to before this point in history because of social media. And so I like to be a conduit in that way by making those things a lot more accessible and easy for people to understand and share with people in their community. And I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but the last thing is that I actually established a green jobs board for that exact reason, also for young people, because again, I felt like all of these things, whether you're trying to get a career in this space, whether you're trying to get started on your activism, in some ways, yes, it's accessible if maybe you entered in those spaces on your university, but if you never had access to that or you were never exposed to that, what do we do with those people? How do we mobilize them? And that's what I'm concerned with, because I wasn't really exposed to those things until I went on my own journey of exploration. So I'm always thinking, how do I make that easier for people to get plugged in, whether it be a job, whether it be an advocacy space. That's how I view my role in my platform, being able to create change and just exist to create that culture shift.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. I really love the idea of a resource hub. And I think in many ways, that's what we're trying to create here over the next 2 hours. And so with that, Vicki, I would love for you to also answer the question, what kinds of change have you been involved in over the course of your life? How did you kind of start and where are you now?
Thank you so much, Rachel and Kristy. It's great to be in conversation with you. And it's great to be here at University of Michigan and with the JCLP. And I want to also give a shout out right at the start to the Temple Beth Emet of Ann Arbor's Dayenu Circle that I know is here today and has sponsored this event. I also just want to reflect, Kristy, on what you're sharing. Something I've really admired about your work is your ability to build community and how important community is, especially the last 2 years when so much community has been created online. And also, you know, we're here at a Jewish climate conference, and just how important community is to Jewish people of all kinds. And so I really see that as a huge contribution of your work. So thank you, Kristy. I got my introduction to climate justice work, maybe similar to Kristy, also when I was in college. I was a college student in North Carolina in the early 2000s and got involved in the student labor movement that was supporting farm worker organizing in North Carolina. Farm workers who were picking cucumbers in the fields to make pickles. We love pickles. Had called upon college students to support them in their campaign to organize our universities to support a boycott to improve the conditions that the workers were fighting for. And it was actually through, this was with FLOC, the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, actually based out of Toledo, Ohio. And it was actually through the farm worker movement and the student labor movement that I had my first introduction to environmental justice. Because perhaps to no surprise to folks here at the conference today, farm workers working outside in the fields, exposed to pesticides, exposed to harsh conditions, heat and sun, which are only getting worse through climate change. So all of my work, you know, over the last 20 years or so has been rooted in that initial understanding that I had, which was also connected to my own learning about my family's immigrant history as, you know, low-wage window washers and dairy farmers 3 generations ago, and seeing sort of some of the same experiences playing out with today's immigrant workers. So all of this infuses kind of my view, my lens, both of how we tackle the climate crisis and also how we organize across difference and across communities for justice. So my focus throughout my career as an organizer has generally been to help what we might call ordinary people, I think all of us here today, our capacity as change makers, as agents of change, to bring us off of the sidelines from people who care about an issue, right? Imagine a basketball stadium or a football field, right? Sitting on the sidelines, being spectators, being invested in the outcome, right? But not being on the field. How do we actually get on the field and see ourselves as players, taking action with others as part of a team on an issue to change history? And my understanding of history is that significant change has only been made when there is an organized movement demanding that change, and that it takes ordinary people to be part of that and to see ourselves as part of that. So I've worked on environmental justice and climate issues in different ways, from working early on to stop fracking in communities, to help communities shut down dirty coal-fired power plants in their neighborhoods. And over the last 2 or 3 years, I really felt called to refocus my energies on the climate movement because of the urgency of the issue, right? We know, and I appreciate young people, and I know we're going to hear from Sophia today, but young people really sounding the alarm. We have 10 years, we have till 2030 to reshape our economy and make the whole scale, large scale changes we need to mitigate the worst of climate change. And I also really felt in the last few years the opportunity to do that, mobilizing within Jewish communities, within my own people, and help to bring us kind of off of the sidelines and into the playing field for climate justice. So that's what I get to do every day at Dayenu.
Wow. Thank you so much, Vicki. You touched on a lot of different points that we're going to come back to, the role of Jewish identity, how to bring your community into all of these things. Those are definitely, I want to get back to those. But I know in our pre-conversations that we've had, about this event, about both of the work that you've done, we've talked a lot about intersectionality. And even in like the first, 10 minutes that we've been together, you both have named, documentation status, race, socioeconomic status, gender, like the role of the way that our identities intersect with each other and where environmental justice kind of lands with that. So climate justice, as you both know and have named, is a very intersectional issue. And so I'd like to invite each of you to share about how that work of yours has kind of become intertwined with the work of anti-racism, which is also something that both of you center in your work with environmental justice. So Vicki, could we please start with you?
Sure. First, let's just be really clear. Jewish communities are racially diverse, right? So we have to imagine when we're speaking to Jewish communities that we're speaking to a racially diverse audience.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's been a shift for me over my life of how I'm viewing kind of who are Jews, right, in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I'm white. I've said that before. I'm Ashkenazi. I have no hesitation saying that I'm white or qualifying it. I recognize that in my life, I benefit from white privilege in this country, the United States, which has centuries of history privileging white skin. Yeah. I also want to highlight a couple of recent studies that I think have been really instructive and informative. In 2019, the Jews of Color Field Building Initiative estimated that 1 in 7 or 1 in 8 Jews identify as a Jew of color. And that more than 20%, 1 in 5 Jewish households include people who identify as non-white. And I also want to encourage everyone here, if you haven't already, to read the report called Beyond the Count, which was researched and published by the Jews of Color Initiative last year in 2021. And in that study, apart from laying out sort of the previous research on the percentage of Jews who identify as people of color, that study, Beyond the Count, demonstrated that a vast majority of respondents, 80%, agreed that they've experienced discrimination in Jewish settings. Okay, this is Jewish communities, right? Just the tip of the iceberg. So let's also look at the mainstream environmental movement in this country, the mainstream climate movement. And I would say that despite many of the gains for people and the environment that have been won for everybody by Black communities, by Indigenous communities, by Latinx communities, by people of color, the environmental movement that has been recognized in media, politics, with grant dollars, has for decades been white. I think that is changing, the public perception is changing. And I will submit that I think that's a big part of why climate action has the urgency and the power that it now has in Washington and in our politics. Furthermore, white people are less concerned about climate change than people of color are in the United States. Okay, so these are just some facts that I think that we all need to be on the same page about to have some important conversations, which is what we're here to do. So for those of us who are white Jews in the climate movement, I think we really have an opportunity to build a strong movement by building relationships within and beyond our Jewish communities, by minimizing the microaggressions that we are bound to commit. Everything from questioning people's Jewishness to assuming that only white Jews are concerned about climate change, and by, as I think many of us do, seeing climate change as a racial justice issue. There is a huge and a growing community of Jewish people, congregations, youth leaders, organizations who are committed to and making commitments to racial justice, and this is very good. I'm here for that. And at Dayenu, we understand that climate change is a racial justice issue, that the climate crisis impacts historically marginalized communities first and worst. That is true. And more people are now starting to feel the impacts of climate change. And so, working in the climate movement, I think that we get to support and advocate for racial and environmental justice, and we get to advocate for our own self-interest. This is like really powerful stuff, to be able to do like all of that at once in one movement. That's really powerful. I think it's really fulfilling, gratifying, transformative. And I also want to say that I give some examples actually of how I see this work being done out in the real world, in the field. I see some Dayenu circles doing really good work on this front. In California, where I live, Dayenu circles have been part of a campaign to end drilling for oil and gas near where people live and go to school. It's called No Drilling Where We're Living. That's the hashtag for the campaign. And this is a campaign that's been run by environmental justice communities, mostly brown, Black, immigrant, and low-income communities who have been getting sick for years because of fossil fuel drilling in their backyards. So Dayenu circles, and these are small groups of people organized in Jewish communities to take action on climate change. They've built relationships, joined coalitions, organized rabbis in key districts, published op-eds, wrote public comments, educated our communities that hadn't previously been involved. And that's something that we all can do. We can learn about and join existing frontline coalitions. Another thing we can do is when we invite speakers, we can pay honoraria, right? Basic stuff. And I'll just conclude by saying, I think in the Jewish climate movement, we have been more successful in external relationships and coalitions than we have been in the internal work in fighting racism in our own communities. And I think there's work to do on both fronts that's meaningful, transformative, and really positive work that I'm excited to do with everybody that's here today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Vicki. You gave, I think, a really great context, I guess, for the time that we're in right now with those statistics and also those examples of what anti-racist climate justice organizing work looks like right now today. And Kristy, I saw you were nodding and making some really excited faces. So I don't want to take up any more time. Same question goes to you. How do you center anti-racism in the work that you do? And how does climate justice as an intersectional issue show up for you?
Yeah, no, thank you, Vicki, for sharing the information from the Jews of Color Network. I shout out to the Jews of Color Network. I love y'all. But basically, I would say, for myself, all my work is centered around this topic. So I would say, just to reference my own statistics, which we'll put in the chat, another report was by the Green 2.0 report. And basically that's a transparency report focused on the lack of diversity and inclusion across pretty mainstream green NGOs as well as foundations. They found that among 40 green major nonprofits, only 20% of the staff identified as a person of color, and only 21% of their senior staff identified as people of color. And in terms of foundations, when we're thinking about funding and philanthropy support, environmental foundations revealed similar numbers, with 25% of their staff identifying as people of color and only 4% of their senior staff and foundations identifying as people of color. So when I think about this question about anti-racism, I'm always thinking about resource distribution within the climate movement. I think about the fact that I've worked with both pretty big mainstream white environmental organizations, but I've also worked with predominantly Black and Brown led environmental justice organizations that don't get the same amount of funding, press, support, and just overall clout that these big mainstream environmental organizations get. And so when we're talking about this question about anti-racism, we have to get very real about organizations' positionality, the ways in which they've extracted from communities of color, and also the lack of redistribution of those resources to the very organizations that deserve those resources, because they are living on the front lines of pollution and extraction. And so when I think about this question, I think about also on, even my position as a young woman of color in this space who doesn't come from a frontline community. And similar to Vicki, I'm always very clear about that. I do not come from a frontline community, even though I am a woman of color, and I identify my privilege and positionality around that. And it's very important to name that, because I think, there's two different issues going on. There's the issue on the institutional level, like what we're talking about, like when it comes to diversity and inclusion in the environmental space. And then there's the lack of resources and redistribution to environmental justice organizations on the front lines. So I just want to start off by first talking about my own experience of the institutional level of navigating microaggressions, navigating the lack of funding for my own work as a woman of color in this space. So to start with that, I would say that, like, you know, I created Brown Girl Green as a platform because I was very frustrated about how I was treated working for white environmental nonprofits who didn't really value my work. I felt very undervalued, and that might not have just been a race thing. It could have been a woman thing. It could have been an age thing. But regardless of that, I think that all the isms combined made me feel very undervalued in the work I was doing. And a big part of Brown Girl Green was about me having a space to kind of rant about that and being like, aren't you also frustrated that all these jobs we can get are unpaid when we have to send money back to our parents who don't have a trust fund? Aren't you mad that, like, when we're entering this room, they only go to the white men to ask about their expertise and overlook you? Aren't you mad that when it comes to talking about mental health and eco-anxiety, most of the time it's only centered around white voices and narratives, not around actually how Black and brown people have to navigate PTSD and anxiety when it comes to the mental health issues that come from coping with the climate crisis? And I got all these responses from young people of color who were like, yeah, someone had to say it. And they're like, yes, I'm glad you put that out there. And so for me, when I view this work, I just feel like there hasn't been enough of a voice for that, enough of a voice on where the institutional changes are needed for even people of color to feel supported in this work. And for me, like, I see some of my other, like, white colleagues and friends who are in environmental nonprofits or companies getting so much funding, so much support, whereas, like, I have to, like, jump through all these hoops and have to, like, go through back doors to, like, find funding and find support. And I think that, like, we have to address that. We have to address, like, if you do have resources and support, a form of anti-racism is thinking about, as an ally, how to redistribute that. And then outside of my own space and other people's space of you know, having the privilege to be in those organizations, when it comes to Black and brown led environmental justice organizations, you know, how are you amplifying them? How are you partnering with them intentionally? And the way that I've done that is through interviews, through amplifying their work. But I think there's not enough mainstream white environmental organizations that are doing enough of that work. And so those are the two ways in which I try to tackle it, and I hope other organizations try to do the same.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Kristy. I think your perspective as a woman of color who's doing this work, but also your experience in all of these different ways of making change, and how you bring in anti-racism, and also how you're making recommendations for how to bring in anti-racist work. I think it's really giving me a lot to think about, and so I really do appreciate that. I'm noticing the time, and we are almost down to our last 5 minutes. So I want to see if either of you have questions to ask each other. I have so many more questions, obviously, always, but I do want to make some space for y'all to just be in conversation with each other. So please, whoever would like to go first.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Vicki a question. You know, a lot of what you do and the sauce of what you do is centering Jewish identity in climate organizing. So I'd love if you could share, like, why is it so important for the Jewish community to get involved with climate right now? And what are the ways you think it's best for them to plug in?
Cool, thanks, Kristy. And I'll try to be brief so I can ask you a question too, before we wrap up. So I started earlier talking about, you know, getting off the sidelines, right? That's a big part of movement building, is having people move from sort of being a passive supporter, caring about an issue, to be active in the movement. And a Pew study a few years ago pointed out that 80% of Jews in the United States are concerned about climate change. But I think if we all just, like, checked in with ourselves for a second and thought about our Jewish friends, family, communities that we might be a part of, like, how many of us are really, like, out there in the streets actively being part of a collective movement, right? Not just the individual actions we might take with our own choices about energy use, but actually part of a social or political movement. Very few of us are. So there's a real opportunity there to kind of, as one of my colleagues, Muriel, says, like, grab our people, like, bring our people along. which is what all of us need to do to build a strong movement and build the power that we need to win real substantial change. Another really important aspect of this for me is to be able to tap into and draw on our spirit, our ruach, our traditions that have like sustained the Jewish people for millennia, and to really actually, like this has been a profoundly moving experience for me personally in this work, is to get to like look at those traditions that have been passed on to me and to carry that forward. And I see that, for example, in a new campaign that Dayenu has launched called All Our Might, which is inspired by the V'ahavta prayer, where we declare our love for God with all of our soul, all of our heart, and all of our might. And that's a source for us to tap into, to commit to fighting the climate crisis with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our might, to preserve this planet that we call home, future generations, right? That's also part of our mandate as Jewish people to fight for. And I just want to put in a little plug here for an action that Ann Arbor Jewish communities, I think Sophia is going to talk about this in a little bit too, but it's worth repeating. With the upcoming Passover holiday, Jewish communities around the country are organizing actions outside of the branches of the major banks and asset managers that are financing the fossil fuel industry, and calling on them to follow their commitments and to stop doing that. And so this Passover, right, our holiday of freedom, of like moving from the narrow place into a better future. So here in Ann Arbor, on April 20th at 3 p.m., Jewish communities and allies are going to be gathering outside the Chase Bank on Main Street to call for freedom from the fossil fuel pharaohs this Passover. And that's just like a flavor of what the Jewish climate movement, can do, the power that we can bring. So I really appreciate that question, Kristy. I think identity, culture, constituency is all really important for movement building.
Yeah, that was wonderful. And I don't want to be the one wrapping us up, but I'm going to be wrapping us up anyway. I know, Vicki, you said you do have a question for Kristy. We will have an opportunity for all of our wonderful speakers to be together in conversation, but you're welcome to ask the question now. And Kristy, if you want to give maybe a 30-second to 1 minute response, and then we can wrap up from there.
So the question I wanted to ask you, Kristy, is I've seen you be sort of one of the most talented people I've seen at drawing people in through our own, through personal choices, fun, entertainment, fashion, all of that, and then directing that into direct action, like stopping pipelines from being built. And that's a hard thing to do. And I wonder how you've approached that, how you see that role of, I think of it sort of as seeing the whole person.
Yeah, I just wanted to relate it back to this conversation, that there's such a spread of anti-Semitism as well as climate denial online. And I just think the role of social media in that is important to create a new narrative and a new perspective on how do we take action on climate action? How do we take climate action as Jewish people on the internet? And I think my summary statement is that I try to always have a compass of my values and my ethics, and I just let that be my guideline, my scorecard for partnerships I take on, for campaigns I support. And it's my hope that by following that inner compass of my values and what I grew up with, and just wanting to challenge misinformation on the internet by bringing in my own experiences while also challenging my own biases, it's my hope that people can feel brought into that conversation, because most of the time people have so much imposter syndrome and they're just worried about do I have to be an expert to do this work? Do I have to be X, Y, and Z thing and be on this pedestal? And my hope is that my platform shows that, no, you can be imperfect, know that there's so much more nuance out there, and that those conversations we've barely scratched the surface of. So we need so many more storytellers to take action and bring in their own diverse perspective into this fight.
And that's such an empowering and exciting note to end on. Thank you so much, Kristy and Vicki, for your vulnerability, your experience, and just sharing yourselves and your knowledge with us today. We'll get a chance to hear from both of you a little bit later, but I'll pass it back to Claire to bring us into our next dyad. Thank you both so much again.
All right. Thank you so much to Vicki Kaplan and Kristy Drutman for sharing your stories and thoughts with us. And thank you to Rachel for moderating their conversation. As a reminder, we will end our event today with a question and answer session for all of our speakers. So please feel free to jot down your questions so they can be asked at the end of the event. Next, we will turn to our second conversation today between Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein and Sophia Rich, moderated by JCLP second year Moss Herberholtz. Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein serves as the Rabbinic scholar and public affairs advisor at Jewish Federations of North America and leads the JEDI, Jewish Equity, Diversity and Inclusion and Racial Justice Initiatives. He most recently served as rabbi in residence at Hazon, the Jewish Lab for Sustainability. He is also the co-founder of Jewish Youth Climate Movement and Kamocha, a community for Black Orthodox Jews. Sophia Rich is a high school junior from Ann Arbor, Michigan, who is passionate about connecting Jewish principles and climate justice. She is a member of the National Leadership Board for the Jewish Youth Climate Movement. Sophia sees climate change as the existential crisis of our generation and has committed herself to taking action and fighting for climate justice. Please see their full bios in our PDF pamphlet. Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein and Sophia Rich will share their perspectives with us as people closely involved with the Jewish Youth Climate Movement. And now I will pass the mic to you all.
Hello, welcome everybody. I'm so honored to be able to moderate this conversation with Rabbi Isaiah and with Sophia. I want to give an image description of myself. My name is Moss Herberholtz. I am a white man with a beard and glasses. I'm also wearing a top hat and a black and gray shirt and scarf with a white background. I'm very glad to be here. The first question I have for both of you is what brought you to this work and what is the Jewish Youth Climate Movement? I'm curious about the why, the how, and the what of the Jewish Youth Climate Movement. And if you can each give an image description when you speak, and that would be great. So maybe if Sophia, if you could share first.
Thank you, Moss. Hi, everyone. My name is Sophia Rich. I'm a 16-year-old white girl, and I have long brown hair, and it's tied up in a ponytail, and I'm wearing a navy long sleeve shirt today. First of all, I just want to say that I'm beyond humbled to be here. Just hearing everyone in that first conversation, all these amazing role models to me as a young person is just amazing, and I can't wait to share my perspective and bring what I can to this conversation. So I was born in Montreal, Canada, so I experienced the very cold temperatures. And then soon I moved over to Lafayette, California, where I experienced the drought and the heat and the dryness of California. And then about 6 years ago, I moved over here to Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is my new home, and I do love it here. And I've gotten to have so many great experiences with the Great Lakes and all the pollution. So I would say environmentalism has always kind of been a central theme that's followed me throughout my life and where I've moved. And then also a quick shout out to my dad, who works for an energy company and who has taught me a lot about sustainable resources and dangers of fossil fuels and renewable energy. And I'm just so thankful to have both my parents who have just kind of made climate justice and environmentalism a very important part of them raising me and me growing up. And I've just learned so much from them. And I'm so happy to bring that into the work I do today. So that kind of innocent child sense in me of getting to experience all these different environments had transformed a little bit when I became a teenager. I'm 16 years old now, and I was exposed to the scary world of performative activism. And I'm happy to define that for some of our older folks today who might not know what that is. But performative activism is kind of a thing on social media where a lot of young people especially post infographics and other things, especially regarding climate justice and other very social justice-y issues that may not be supported by facts. So seeing all this stuff when I first got my phone, the dangers of climate justice just scared me. And I didn't really know how to react to it. I was scared. I saw that this was my responsibility as a young person to take action. And I had known that growing up, but there was a sense of urgency that came upon me and I didn't really know how to deal with that. And I know in our first conversation, people were talking about eco-anxiety, which became a very prominent factor in me and my role in this work. So I was kind of lost for a little bit. And then thankfully I found Jewish Youth Climate Movement, which has been an amazing part of my life. And I was open to the world of Jewish principles, and that we're kind of able to build this work from love and being surrounded by young people. I've gotten a whole different perspective on climate activism through a Jewish lens, and all the actions we do at JYCM, we're able to kind of have a sense of positivity and hope while also acknowledging that this is an urgent issue and is partially a huge responsibility of young people in my generation, that this is something that must be dealt with. But it's up to us, but we have to take it in a different light, and we have to include our Jewish values and our youth values of innocence and hope. So yeah, I'm really thankful for JYCM, and I'm sure Rabbi Rothstein will explain a little bit more about that, but that's my perspective as a member. Moss, is this a great time for me to ask my question to Rabbi Isaiah? Awesome.
Yeah, that would be great.
Rabbi Isaiah, I kind of had a question for you about your perspective, also being involved in JYCM, but being a rabbi and more of a staff and a mentor to us. We're so thankful for you. But do you see your role as a rabbi and everything you do with social justice and climate justice? Is that for you part of being a rabbi, or is that something you do separately? I know as a young person, when I need guidance, whether it be through religion or something else in my life morally, I usually look to my rabbi and I ask the question. And I was wondering if you could share your perspective on that and how you advise young people who ask you about this idea of climate justice.
Wow. Shalom, everyone, friends, everyone who joined us today. Firstly, it's a tremendous honor to be here with each of you, just echoing what Sophia shared, just being with mentors and teachers and friends. And I'm grateful to JCLP, University of Michigan, for hosting this really important conversation. And I'm also just really moved by the fact that we're here and we're taking our time on a Sunday. Personally, there's so much going on, I imagine, for each of us, and then also so much going on in this world. And just for my visual identifiers, I have short, lightish brown hair, green eyes, I'm 6'1". I have a little scruff, I'm wearing glasses, and I have light skin tone. And Sophia, your question, one, you're just such a light. You really filled my heart with everything you just said. I would say that, you know, with the rabbinic role, but also I would say for each of us as Jewish people, the ideal is that there's fusion, that our identities are not compartmentalized, where I put this part of myself here, that part of myself here. The ideal embodied experience as a Jewish person is that we actually are bringing our full selves to our Jewish expression. And so for me, not only my namesake as Isaiah, I'm the other Isaiah, the first Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, known to be a prophet of justice. So it's very much in our tradition. And then also something that, yes, I do feel that is a part of my rabbinate. Thank you for that. And I'll also just share by way of note of introduction, what brought me to this work. I would first say it's in my bones a little bit. My family instilled in me the value of caring for the earth. I was raised eating organic, being told that soda is poison. And I really only tried red meat for the first time when I was in middle school. And my family members around the country have been growing their own vegetable gardens for as long as I can remember. And just recently, my cousin, Marie Magruder, she actually, we are descendants of slaves and enslaved people from American soil. And as a 7th generation survivor of the African slave trade, my cousin Marie, she repurchased land that our ancestors were enslaved on and started the Magruder Farms. Specifically on climate justice, I would say I started, you know, something that was mentioned before. I believe it was, I forget who actually mentioned this, but about imposter syndrome. You know, I started at Chazon as rabbi in residence in 2017. Moss, where I met you actually at Isabella Friedman, I met the CEO of Chazon and he offered me this position. And I said, I felt like an imposter. I said, I don't know if I'm your guy. I'm not sure I have the knowledge base for this role. And he said to me, don't worry. He said, you'll learn. And I did. I met incredible leaders like Rabbi Ellen Bernstein, who I believe is presenting after this, who showed me the way. But to be honest, I wasn't really fully in. I wasn't locked in. I was still involved in other passion-oriented areas that I was spending my time in care. But I ended up being introduced to a NASA scientist. And she zapped me. She really did. And I still feel the sting of what she shared with me. And that really set me on my own journey when it comes to climate justice and environmental sustainability. And I'll say there's really two things that anchor me, and I'll share just another brief word maybe about JYCM, the Jewish Youth Climate Movement. And Sophia, goes to your question about the Jewish tradition. I would say I have two anchors. One is the Jewish tradition. And what I mean by that is that there are many teachings relating to climate change, climate justice, caring for the planet in the Jewish tradition. But this morning, as I was getting ready for this program, I was saying the morning prayers, a line jumped out at me from King David. There's a Psalm 65 or 3 that talks about redemption, the Messianic age. It says, L'dat ba'aretz darchecha, the whole world will understand the divinity of the world. B'chol goyim yeshuatecha, all the nations will live in a world of a redemptive age. And then one of the final lines is Eret Yitna Yavula, Yavarchenu Elokim, that this idea that the earth will actually provide for us an abundance of harvest. We'll have everything we need. And it strikes me, just because if we are truly the arbiters of the Jewish past, the Jewish future, if we are truly people, each of us, regardless of our faith identity, as arbiters of the future, how could we manifest that messianic age if there isn't a planet that's actually giving off what we need it to, if the planet isn't in a healthy place? So this is not only a nice idea, but I truly think it's a mandate. And that keeps me grounded, realizing that integrated throughout the Jewish tradition. And then my second anchor, undoubtedly, really is the youth and the leadership of the Jewish Youth Climate Movement. I'll just shortly, and I'll pass the mic back to you, Moss, but I would say that the way I was raised in Muncie, New York, as in an interracial family, as an insider-outsider, through most of my life, even till today, I grapple with my identity. I was pretty disappointed by the structures, I still kind of am, by the structures that were provided for youth leadership. And it was something that was on my heart and mind as I was working in a school setting, working in informal and formal Jewish education. But then I had the distinct honor of meeting Liana Rothman, the other co-founder of the Jewish Youth Climate Movement. And I'll say today that what anchors me is their leadership. I learned from them truly on the regular. So that's a little bit about how we got here. And then just of the what of JYCM. And Sophia, you could correct me if I'm wrong, we're about 30 plus national leadership board members from around the country. We have 38 chapters from around the country, involved in synagogues and schools and other kinds of institutions, as well as other partnering organizations who have joined us today. And it's just really, I would say I think we're one of the only Gen Z-led Jewish organizations on planet Earth.
Yeah, thank you both for that. Sophia, I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about what JYCM is doing currently. Yeah, what kind of initiatives y'all are involved in at the moment?
Yeah, of course, I would love to talk about that. Thank you, Rabbi Isaiah, for that wonderful overview on JYCM. Rabbi Isaiah did mention the groups we have under the leadership board, or may I say equal to the leadership board at JYCM. So we do have a leadership board of about 30 high school and middle school students throughout the United States and one Canadian member, which is super exciting. But we center most of our work in our Kutzot, which is a group of kutzas throughout the United States and Canada, which are derived from different institutions, Jewish institutions. Here in Ann Arbor, we have the Ann Arbor Kutza, which is just a group of kids living in Ann Arbor and surrounding areas who do work provided by the National Leadership Board at the Jewish Youth Climate Movement. But a lot of our Kutzo are centralized in different synagogues and different religious groups throughout the United States. But basically, we like for most of our actions to happen at a local level. So even though the leadership board is providing curriculum and different ideas for actions and diversity and equity and inclusion, instructions and guidance, most of our actions do happen through our Kutzo, and that's something we pride ourselves on, as a lot of eco organizations don't necessarily have that same structure. They have those leaders at the top, but we focus a lot of our action on local people led by youth. Since youth are really mindful and aware of different actions and different problems that are facing their towns and their communities. So yeah, I was just so thankful to be a part of Jewish Youth Climate Movement and to have that experience personally of being on the National Leadership Board and then also being part of a Kutza and a leader. It's just such a different experience, but the culture in the movement is just so amazing, and just that cohesion between the structure and kind of flipping the pyramid of power of being led by our Kutzot is something that I'm so proud of in all our work as the movement. I'd like to thank everyone who's part of JYCM for working to do that.
Yeah, amazing. I'm wondering, Rabbi Isaiah mentioned that JYCM is maybe one of the only Gen Z organizations fighting for climate justice within the Jewish communal world. And I'm wondering if y'all could share a little bit more about what are some of the unique challenges that the organization faces as a Gen Z organization.
Thank you, Rabbi Isaiah. Something we've been talking about a lot recently is the tokenization of youth, which has become a very prevalent issue in different eco spaces and also just general social justice spaces. Me here being the only 16-year-old, I'm really thankful and happy to be here, but in a lot of different spaces, hi, it's Sophia, she's our young person, she's going to give us our young perspective, which is great. I'm more than happy to do that. But I think especially thinking about the climate crisis, we need to think about all the responsibility that is being held by these young people. And the fact that we Gen Z, this is kind of our responsibility to deal with this crisis. So being referred to as the young person 24/7 is something that has hurt our movement a little bit, but something that we've also been working to change fundamentally. We have faith, we have power, that we know that if we're able to change this, we're able to change like the Jewish religion as a whole and how we view young people. So yeah, that's definitely something we've struggled with in different spaces, but through our amazing staff and mentors, we've been able to kind of get our name out there, which has been great. And then also just that idea of eco-anxiety, being young people having all this pressure on us. It's hard. We're sometimes in different calls as a board meetings, and we think about, hey, like this is a lot that we're dealing with, and we're able to center ourselves and kind of return to why we're here and what drives us. And that's really helped. And me, something that's helped me personally is the fact that I'm able to acknowledge a lot of Jewish history and see that we as a religion are able to create change. We have the power to do so. We've done so much in the past. My great-great-grandma, my great-grandma, they weren't even able to have bat mitzvahs because they were women. And seeing me at my bat mitzvah, like the change that has in the feminism spectrum, and now we're here dealing with climate justice, which is just amazing. And that's something we're able to pride ourselves on, all of us, everyone here who's a Jew. Kudos to us. But a lot of stuff we're doing as the Jewish Youth Climate Movement is, as they mentioned in the first conversation, we're working on our Earth Staters, which is awesome. Something I'm very involved with here in Ann Arbor. And as I talked about earlier with our Kutzot being the driving members of our movement, our Earth Staters are kind of derived from the idea of a Freedom Stater, which happened a while back with Martin Luther King and everything, where Jewish people had these Staters, but they kind of transformed the message as they were now fighting for racial equality. So we see this and we take inspiration from the Jewish people back then who were able to do this. And now we're coming up with these Seders throughout the country that are called Earth Seders, and we're talking about climate justice, but we're also including different Jewish principles. And yeah, I think that's what I can say about us as a youth movement. I'm definitely thankful to be a part of a movement that's led by other young people. It's very comforting for me as a young person to have that support from all my wonderful board members and all my lovely Kutso. So yeah, it's been great.
And we'll just say, Sophia, we're also really grateful for all of your leadership. And I would say, on the note of challenges, the work I do each day working for the Jewish Federations of North America, you might know that Jewish federations have been around for over 100 years, about serving people in their most vulnerable times of need, and also addressing the greatest crises that have impacted the Jewish people, but frankly, the globe over the last century. Even now, we've led a campaign of over $40 million to provide aid to Ukrainian refugees. And it's just similar on the note of climate justice. We also play a profound role. And, the note of, and we ought to continue that. I would just say on the note of challenges, like, being involved in creating engagement strategies for Jewish communal life in the 21st century and belonging, supporting the most socially and culturally diverse generation in American history, and then also how we sustain American democracy around the world, and better the world every single day. I think there's three challenges, and I don't know if they're exactly aligned for climate justice as a social issue that we're facing, and let's say racial justice, but there's three things that I think I feel is a challenge, or challenges me. One is the ideological piece, the recognizing, believing in science, believing in the facts, but then also because of identity politics, because of culture wars, it's so hard, the ideological divides that exist and how we address that. And I think the power of education, the power of coming together, a profound tool for bridging divides, especially when one person is speaking one language and the other is speaking another. So the question of how are we speaking and communicating to different audiences? And Kristen, I believe you were talking about in your work with a multivocal approach, how are we bridging those divides? On a similar note of divide, the intergenerational question, I think is real. Sophia, you mentioned about being tokenized. Again, when you're brought in, but you're brought in because of your age, not because of, right? So it's almost sometimes, you see, it's like two different species. I don't even know how to talk to someone who's that age, let's say. Some people say the intergenerational divides. And I just think that's super profound for all of the social issues I think we might be facing in this generation. And again, a huge opportunity. Look at the room. Look at who's here with us today. And also, I know so much of the work of JYCM, the Jewish Youth Climate Movement, is also building programming that's intergenerational. And then the third thing that I would share is, Sophia, you also mentioned this language of performative activism, I think, which I really appreciated. It reminds me of another phrase that I sometimes use around the justice and equity, diversity and inclusion work, which is optics inclusion. When you say you're doing something, you try to bring someone in for a minute, and then 2 days later, it's not integrated, it's not baked in. And so behavioral change, really engaging in behavioral change. I know I'm amongst social workers in training. And we know you don't need to get your MSW to know behavioral change is hard. I think each of us in our own ways struggle with that. But I would say that it really, for each of us, the question of what choices do we hold sacred? What are holy choices we make? And behavioral change, when we're trying to work on ourselves every day, we're keeping in mind what's sacred, that if I do this, it means something. And if I don't do this, it means something. And I think that as creatures of habits, the behavioral change that we need is a challenge, I think, for us as individuals, as institutions, and then as systems, as countries. So those three, I think, again, together with everyone on this call, I think we could rise to these challenges. I think we can.
And thank you both for sharing that. I think is in particular talking about behavioral change and how that's a challenge. and also thinking about how not just on an individual level of behavioral change, but as a whole, and because right, our individual choices don't actually have that much impact on the state of the world. It's as a whole, and so yeah, not just shifting one person's behaviors, but yeah, having that be a wider shift.
You know, and Moss, what's mind-blowing also about that though is that we have precedent that one person can actually change a system, sort of. Obviously, it's never one person, but one person can influence a circle of it. But you're right.
Yes.
You know.
Absolutely. Yeah, and even within Judaism, the concept that saving one life is saving the world, right? Like a small start to something can lead to a huge a shift. So absolutely. So thank you again. We have a few minutes left, and I just want to know from each of you, what is your dream, your vision, and your hope for JYCM, for the Jewish community, and for the world, as it relates to climate justice? Just a small little question before we finish.
Thank you. I will start with a very quick response, even though that is a very loaded question. In JYCM, we have our movement principles, and they're kind of different bullet points that we're guided by in our work and things we always try and keep in mind. But I think our end goal out of all those principles is to make climate justice a central value in the Jewish community. Hopefully in the future, you will walk into different Jewish institutions and climate justice will be talked about and Jews will be motivated and taking action on this, and we'll see change throughout the whole religion. In ways in JYCM, we motivate people to do this work and make this dream future possible is through our Jewish values and building this world from love. And we kind of take, as people were talking about earlier, the idea of storytelling is something that we've been working really hard on recently. We had our storytelling campaign. I see Rabbi Isaiah is very excited about that. So hopefully in the future, when you walk into different Jewish institutions, stories will be told regarding climate justice and people will be motivated. And we know that's how we motivate our community, because you walk into temple and people are telling stories. That's how we as Jews motivate ourselves to take work. So throughout the movement, we've all written our own climate stories, why we got involved in this work and what motivates us and what role JYCM plays in that. And how I ended my personal story is by saying that I have to leave the story unfinished because my work isn't done. So I'm hoping that last line kind of resonates with everyone. And I use that line to drive me in my work and to help me build up this dream future I see for the Jewish community. And yeah.
I think I just need to say amen to that and l'chaim. And Sophia, what you shared reminds me in 3 weeks, we have this holiday of Passover, which is about not only telling our collective story, but also in each generation and each year to reclaim, to almost realign. And I think Kristy also shared about this new narrative, an evolved narrative. So I just echoing that, that we're able for our generation to reclaim this narrative that we are people who have this moral, spiritual responsibility, but more than that, and then as a species. So that's just amen. Amen.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that amen. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you again both for being here. I'm so grateful to have been able to speak with you and to hear from you. And now we're going to pass it back to Claire.
All right. Thank you so much to Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein and Sophia Rich for sharing your insights with us. And thank you to Moss for moderating their conversation. So we will now take a 5-minute break and return with our final speaker conversation of the day, as well as a question and answer with all of our speakers. Welcome back. We will now move to our final speaker pair for the day with Rabbi Ellen Bernstein and Rabbi Dr. Ariel Mayse, moderated by JCLP second year Erica Kuhn-Fink. Rabbi Ellen Bernstein is an eco-theologian, spiritual leader, writer, and creative. She founded Shomrei Adamah, Keepers of the Earth, the first national Jewish environmental organization in 1988. Rabbi Ellen Bernstein continues to write and teach on the ecology of the Hebrew Bible and serves on the advisory board of the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, the steering committee of Third Act/Faith, and the advisory board of the Green Shabbat Project. Rabbi Dr. Ariel Mayse is an assistant professor of religious studies at Stanford University. He previously served as the director of Jewish studies and visiting assistant professor of modern Jewish thought at Hebrew College in Newton, Massachusetts, and was a research fellow at the Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. Go Blue. Please see their full bios in our PDF pamphlet. Rabbi Ellen Bernstein and Rabbi Dr. Ariel Mayse will speak about the importance of a cultural shift in how we understand our collective relationship to nature. And now I will pass the mic to you all.
Thank you, Claire. I'd like to give a brief image description of myself. My name is Erica Kuhn-Fink. My pronouns are she, her. I'm wearing a green and white shirt. I'm a white woman with gold earrings, brown glasses, short brown hair. I have a painting behind me and a plant to my right. Ellen, can you please provide an image description of yourself?
Sure, and hi everybody. I'm a white woman with long orange earrings, short, whitish, strawberry blondish hair, green sweater, and a scarf. She, her pronouns.
Thank you. And Ariel.
Hi, I use he, him pronouns. Supposedly I'm at Stanford according to my background, but I'm actually standing in my kid's bedroom. I have scruffy short hair, a longish pandemic beard. I have lightish skin tone and the haggard eyes of someone who's gone through a pandemic with small children.
There you go. Thank you for doing that. So we have a lot to talk about today, so I'd like to just dive right in. Both of you have personal backgrounds rooted in direct relationships to the earth and land. You also both engage with religious texts and find connection to the environment and the natural world. I'd like to start with you, Rabbi Ariel Mayse. Could you start with a little bit about your background and your perspective on this work as a leader with rabbinic training?
Thanks. Absolutely. It's wonderful to be here. Indeed, I mirror the sense of honor shared with all the other speakers. I grew up in Fresno, California, which is kind of the middle of nowhere unless you are driving to Yosemite and you've gotten a little bit lost. But one of the wonderful things about growing up in Fresno is that I grew up in the heart of American agriculture, or at least a particular iteration of it. Both of my parents were involved in sustainable agriculture. My father was a professor of entomology. My mom was an organic farm inspector. And the sequoias and Yosemite were my greater backyard. I grew up in a small piece of land with lots of elements of an active farm. And so I grew up really in step with and in touch with the seasons of farming, of the experience of living close to soil. And yet at the same time, even from a relatively early age, I remember driving through the Central Valley and seeing the devastation of industrialized farming and industrialized animal agriculture on the surrounding world. I watched in my lifetime the water table drop significantly and then precipitously. I also grew up knowing about the human costs that come with agriculture in America. Many of my friends growing up were the children of migrant farm workers who were sometimes in school, but not always in school. And growing up in a white minority community really gave me a very different relationship to what it means to be a human being in this kind of natural world. In terms of my own spiritual journey, I came to religion in college, but I came to religion out of the traditions of martial arts that were deeply in touch with the natural world. I often say that my first religious experience before I had any real framework or vocabulary for it was at the end of my black belt test in the middle of the Sierra Nevada mountains, breathing together with the trees and breathing together with the mountains and being breathed by them. And everything else after that was the attempt to try and find a vocabulary for thinking about that and thinking about it in constructive and creative ways. And that experience and that moment of awakening, that moment of enkindling, as it were, which I've carried with me since then, led me to do a PhD in Jewish studies, but it also led me to pursue a career in the rabbinate, not as a synagogue rabbi, but as a rabbi who speaks from within the tradition, as someone who is actively seeking to create and to learn from the tradition, but also to take an active role in creating the tradition such that it can be a part of not only solving the problems, but creating the vocabulary to be able to deal with them.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And Rabbi Ellen Bernstein, who I'm going to refer to as Ellen because I know her a little bit. Ellen, can you speak to a little bit about your background and your perspective on this work?
Sure. Also, I just want to say it's great to be here with everybody. It's great to be here with Ariel. And I'm so excited that you guys at University of Michigan are doing this. And we'll talk more about that later. So I was always an outdoor kid growing up. I had a difficult family situation as a young person, and I think that being out in nature was really a great source of solace and inspiration for me. I was born Jewish, but I didn't have a lot of Jewish culture in our family growing up. And as a young person, well, besides enjoying the outdoors, one thing that I also very much share with Ariel is that I was always looking for a vocabulary, a way to express these incredibly deep feelings I had about the natural world. And even as a very young person, I can remember taking drives up. I grew up in New England, in Massachusetts. And I remember taking drives to the White Mountains when I was a kid and being shocked at all of the billboards everywhere advertising, all of these really mundane things that just seemed to me such an insult on the natural world. And I started studying religion in high school and also environmental studies in high school. And I ended up going to one of the first programs in environmental studies in the country at UC Berkeley. And that was such a profound relief for me to be involved in a program where there are people like me who were already at that age, totally committed to environmental, trying to figure out what we could do to address environmental problems. And most people who graduated, so I graduated UC Berkeley in 1975. Most people who graduated, there weren't jobs at that time in environment other than doing environmental impact statements. And that didn't interest me at all. I was always interested in the spiritual dimensions. And I ended up running a whitewater river rafting company with a friend for several years. And basically we taught about the ecological dimensions on our river trips. And just quickly, so I still wasn't really Jewishly oriented. I got into Judaism in Berkeley, being invited to a Passover Seder through the Aquarian Minyan in Berkeley, and discovering that maybe there was an ecological connection. I started studying one-on-one with Ruvain Goldfarb, who's my first teacher. We look at the Parsha of the week together, and I was blown away at all of these ecological dimensions of Torah that I had no idea existed. So that's the very early part. So maybe I should stop there.
Okay, great. Thank you for sharing that, your background. So we can continue this conversation with you, Ellen. Where does your passion lie within the umbrella of Judaism and the ecological work that you're doing?
Okay, so then I founded Shomer Adama, the first Jewish environmental organization, after looking for years for a Jewish environmental organization. And so my passion is about communicating the aliveness of the world to other people, and particularly to Jews, and also the fact that we have these Jewish texts, which when I came to them, I felt like people weren't understanding our text at all from an ecological perspective. And what I tried to do in the work of Shomrei Adamah was about looking at the Bible and Jewish texts and trying to develop a foundation in Jewish ecological thought. So that was like the first 10 years of my work. But over the years, I mean, I've been at this for 35 years now. So driving forces for me were really about language, the Hebrew language, looking at the ecological dimensions of Hebrew language. Also, celebration has been a huge part of my work, developing Tu B'Shvat as the Jewish New Year of the Trees as an ecological festival, and conveying the joy of that we have these holidays in our tradition. I feel that Jewish holidays are one of the major gifts to the world, and that that we need holidays to rejuvenate ourselves, to build communities, to give us solace, especially in this time of eco-anxiety. So anyway, those are a few things that I'm passionate about.
Thank you. Great. And Ariel, can you speak a little bit to your passions within this work?
Sure. Thanks, Erica. In a sense, I guess my passion is the commitment that we need new ideas that draw from deep wells. And what I mean by that is that I see my work working and happening at the intersection in between four conversations. The first is the conversation between halakha and agadah. Halakha, best perhaps understood as a kind of Jewish religious law, and agadah, which are the narratives and the theological dimensions of our tradition. Those exist not as a kind of dyad of polarities, but as a sustained conversation across time. Obligations are a critical part of what I think Judaism brings to the table, a theory of obligation and a toothsome environmental ethic, which is not just about individual moral choices, but indeed obligations. But on the other hand, that must be paired with the fact that we act from amid stories. Sophia and many others have talked today about the necessity of thinking differently about the stories in which we find ourselves and our actions that reflect thereof. I would say also that rituals, as I understand them, can be revolutionary. Rituals don't just confirm our beliefs, they upseat and upstage and transform our beliefs. The second conversation is the conversation between science and religion. On the one hand, science is a critical part of this story. I teach at Stanford, which, as most people know, is a STEM-heavy institution with some humanities as well. It's very hard to convince scientists, at least at my institution, and many within the fields of environmental studies and earth sciences, that religion has anything important to bring to the table. And yet, on the other hand, it's eminently clear from what we see happening that technology is not the answer, not the only answer to the questions that we face. Scientific facts, as we know from the most recent IPCC reports, are not enough to transform behaviors. We need narratives. And as Ellen said, we need new ways of thinking, we need new ways of speaking, new ways of communicating, and new ways of understanding. This is why I think religion is so important, not just because there are lots of religious people in this world, which there are, or that religion is good at motivating people, which it is sometimes, or that religions are international, which some of them are, or that religion has all the answers, which is something that I think is indefensible. On the other hand, religion is revolutionary. It shows us ways of knowing or ways of acting that are alternatives, alternative ways of theorizing our world, of valuizing or evaluating different ethical choices, of thinking about the value of the things in our world. I often start my religion and ecology class asking my students to tell me what the value of a grove of trees or a pod of whales is. And their answers are telling. And religions offer alternatives to the economic and social structures that drive so much of our economy and of our way of being. And I would say one final thing is that my passion is for developing a language to think about brokenness. Most Jewish eco-theology begins with the book of Genesis, which I think is wonderful. There are processes that have been set into motion that we will see the outcomes of and we cannot avoid at this point, which will be devastating to our planet. Part of what I try to do is to develop a language of Jewish environmental theology that takes seriously that fact and develops a language that comes from the book of Job, that comes from the book of Lamentations, that comes from the parts of the book of Isaiah that are less glamorous and glorious, or the parts of the book of Jeremiah that speak about resilience in the face of tragedy.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more, Ariel, about some examples of where you see these religious texts offering insight or understanding into how we engage with the environment in ways that other avenues don't offer us.
Great. So much of the American environmental story is founded in rights, just like American law. My right to do this, my right to choose that, my right to choose this. And that has to do also with the sensibility that market individualism is really going to be the solution out of this problem. One of the things that Jewish thought, theology, and Jewish law in particular forces us to confront is an alternative mode of thinking and an alternative mode of social structure in which obligation is the foundation. Obligations to others, obligations to other people, but it's a web of reciprocity and kinship that extends also to the non-human world. Here, my own work has been deeply informed by the work of Kyle White, who is an environmental scholar, climate justice activist and organizer, and indigenous thinker at the University of Michigan, actually, who describes what he calls an epistemology of crisis, where people who are afraid double down on the things that they know and dig themselves in deeper to defend their own privilege, as opposed to an epistemology of coordination in which kinship, obligation, networks of resilience come to the fore. The languages of Jewish law really are about that, and it provides a kind of cognate structure for this way of thinking. In specific, one of the things, two of the things, three of the things, four of the things that American law has and international law, very difficult time conceiving of is cumulative damage that is done over time to the non-human world or indeed to other people. Foreseeable damage that can be foreseen, but it's not clear exactly how and what will happen. But there is a sense that something will happen. Jewish law provides visions of indemnity in which one is obligated not only to pay for the actions that they have done, but not to do things that endanger the life of others or endanger the livelihood of others. Jewish law provides a way of thinking about something called slow violence that the philosopher Robert Nixon has written about, which is the destruction of communities and individuals over a long period of time through 1,000 tiny cuts. Jewish law has a language for this as well as a language for thinking about externalized costs of doing business, in which you cause other people to pay for your profits. Jewish law has a firm handhold on all of these concepts and can provide a way of thinking beyond them. I'm drawn to the world of the mystics. That's both in terms of my own religious, you might say my own religious journey, and also in terms of my own intellectual thinking. The mystics describe a world that shimmers with divinity, in which all aspects of the world are filled with divinity. And I use the word shimmer there in the word that Deborah Bird Rose uses it in her study of the Yolngu Aboriginal tribes in Australia, of what happens when a world is seen as active and vital and not passive and as a recipient of our own intentions. Jewish mysticism has a world in which God is entirely present, and yet in which the land is an actor and not simply an object. I find myself drawn to the world of eco-poetry as well. And here I've taken I've learned from Ellen the necessity of thinking about poetry as a deep way of both creating new narratives, unseating our assumptions about the world around us, and yet welcoming us in with a beckoning hand.
Thank you. Ellen, I'm hoping that you can shed some light as well on the same question about some examples of where you see religious texts offering something different to this conversation.
Sure. So I started reading Genesis 1 when I was in my early 30s, and that was my introduction to ecological approaches to the Bible. And I'm still stunned at how much Jewish wisdom, how much ecological wisdom, excuse me, is lodged in Genesis 1. And I'll just give a couple of examples from that. So just to begin with, so Genesis 1 is the story of the 7 days of creation, and 6 days of creation and Shabbat. And on each day, a different aspect of creation is created. And at the end of almost every day, God says that it was good. God sees the creation and says that it was good. And a lot of people relate to Genesis 1 and some of our texts as like kid stuff. They don't take it really seriously. It's mythic, it's kid stuff, it doesn't really matter. But this whole notion of goodness, of the goodness of each aspect of creation that's created, Maimonides talked about the word tov, or good, meaning having integrity, that each aspect of creation has integrity, it has value, it matters. We don't just treat the earth is something just to walk on and exploit and use however we want to enhance our own lives, but to understand that we are part of this whole system. Another example is that on the 3rd day of creation, a lot of people associate that with the day that trees are created. But basically what's happening on that 3rd day is you have the seeds. The word seed is repeated over and over again. And there's just this sense of how important seeds are for perpetuating this biological creation that's happening here, and how important that sustainability is baked in with this whole concept of seeds. Also, a lot of people sort of reject Genesis 1 because they think that humanity, that on the 6th day, right, we have God saw that it was very good, and the 6th day is the day that humanity is created. However, what the line says in particular is God saw everything that God had created, and behold, it was very good. And most people in modernity assume that it's the humans created on the 6th day that is very good. And in fact, it's the entire creation. But so it's in the text, right? But the way that we have come to read text is extremely human-centered, human apart from the rest of nature, instead of human embodied in the whole ecosystem. So those are just a few examples right from reading the very first chapter of Genesis. And then for me, what I've been thinking a lot about is how the ideas and the language of Genesis then kind of goes underground and then pops up. It's sort of like, mushrooms, right? Going underground and then popping up at different points throughout the rest of Torah. And that's what's has really engaged me.
Thank you. So, Ellen, as somebody who has engaged in Jewish education, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on what are Jewish educational programs and institutions' role in this work?
Well, thanks. And thank you, as I mentioned right from the beginning of our conversation together, that that it's really a delight that all of you students at Michigan Social Work School are putting this on. And this is the first time I've been involved in a Jewish educational institution program on the environment. And to me, that is a very sad statement about the state of this kind of thinking in Jewish professional educational circles. And so for years, I tried to get a master's degree in Judaism and ecology to happen at various seminaries. And, you know, people always said, there's no money for this. It's not the most important thing, you know. And so I really believe that ecological thinking affects and our relationships with all of nature affect pretty much everything that we do and think about, and we just need to find the ways in to these topics. And I believe there should at the very least be an ecological track as part of programs in seminaries for all rabbis and Jewish educators. This is the most important issue of our day, and the fact that this is not being addressed in Jewish educational higher institutions is very sad, and there's something very wrong going on there. So, and we can talk more, but I just wanted to say a little bit to begin with.
Great, thank you. So we actually only have 5 minutes left, and I'm hoping that Ariel can respond to the same question about Jewish institutions and their role in this work.
I would answer this with a yes and kind of answer, in that the role that Jewish institutions have taken thus far, and the role that this theme, whether we call it ecology or environmental ethics or all the questions around the climate crisis, has taken in Jewish spaces, is it's obviously of increasing importance, and that's great. However, my experience one generation after Ellen's wasn't any different. I didn't take a class on religion and ecology in graduate school, wasn't required, nor did I have any inclination in my rabbinical school training, such as it was, that this would be a paramount issue for the Jewish people. Now, I was interested in this because I care about this and because of the formative experiences that I had. There is no reason, and in fact, there are so many reasons that there should be, that this needs to be a central theme in rabbinical seminaries, because whether or not rabbis are out in the streets trying to effect change, this is going to shape the lives of their communities in ways that we are only beginning to see. The work that the Jewish groups are doing is incredible. On the other hand, greenwashing our tradition doesn't help. It doesn't help anyone. Saying that we have all the answers, that we have many answers from the tradition, doesn't necessarily help. I feel that there's a missed opportunity to go even deeper. Our tradition has things not only that confirm the nature, the vocabularies of contemporary environmental discourse, but go farther in more radical directions. And in this sense, I think that the wells of our tradition remain untapped, or the wells of our tradition are waiting to come into full fruition, because there is so much in our literature, in our theological teachings, in our legal teachings, that is truly, truly radical. And in that sense, the work that is being done to draw upon that tradition, to mobilize that tradition, there's more, like the iceberg hidden beneath the surface. There's more there that can be drawn upon and ought to be drawn upon.
Thank you both for your time and for engaging with this conversation. We will look forward to hearing more from you in the Q&A portion. So I'm hoping that our audience is gathering up questions for the Q&A part. And yes, if you are interested in doing that, you can put your links in the chat so that folks can access those. So at this time, I'm going to pass it back to Claire.
All right. I want to thank so much Rabbi Ellen Bernstein and Rabbi Dr. Ariel Mayse for your insightful comments and perspectives. I also want to thank Erica too for moderating. So we will now shift to our final component today, our question and answer with all of our speakers. So audience members, please add any questions you have of our speakers in the chat, and speakers, please also feel free to ask questions of each other that may have come up for you throughout our conversations. To ask your question in the chat, please direct message your question to me, Claire Lauer, or please raise your hand by using the raise hand function, where you can click on the reactions button on the bottom of your Zoom screen and then click raise hand. Right, so it looks like we have our first question from Kayla. So Kayla, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, everybody. First of all, I'm so happy to be here, and it was great listening to all of you. And I have my question written down, so I'll just be reading it from the screen. So I was wondering if some of you can describe what you / your organizations are doing in terms of promoting ethical / climate-based food consumption within the Jewish community. I'm curious about this for a few reasons. One, I'm a vegetarian, and two, at shul yesterday, the Devar Torah was about ethical food consumption, and I learned yesterday that the conservative movement pushed for a more ethical hechsher about 10 years ago, but there was pushback from the Orthodox Union. So unfortunately, it didn't really take off. So I'm just curious about what steps you / your organizations have taken.
Is there anyone who would like to answer this question first? Ellen, I think I see you unmuted. So Ellen or Vicki, if either of you have a response, I see that both of you are unmuted. Vicki, would you like to start?
I'm happy to share a quick response. Would love to hear from others as well. Thanks, Kayla, for the question. I'll share a short story. So recently, I had the opportunity to help with, here, I even have a sticker. I can show this. Can folks see this? Taking Down Goliath. This was our first climate organizing training specifically for college students that was hosted by Penn, Hillel, and attended by students at Penn and students at Drexel in Philadelphia. And one of the students who participated came up to one of the trainers at the end and said, thank you. I really felt like this was not like a gatekeepy kind of environment, and that I could come as I am without sort of expectations of my personal behaviors and choices, and be accepted as somebody wanting to be part of Jewish climate organizing. That was really meaningful for me to hear that. And so I just wanted to share that story, but that also policy addressing, we at Dayenu, we're focused on large scale policy. And so I think about like the meat industry and agricultural industry in the US and globally, and how do we affect legislation at the state level, at the federal level, how do we affect corporate practice? So that's really where I think you'll see Dayenu, focused on those efforts. But I would love to hear what others have to say.
So speakers, feel free to unmute yourself and just jump in if you have anything to add. Yeah, Ariel.
So I, like Ellen, don't have an organization, and Stanford doesn't really care what I think about these particular issues, although they're trying to move in a food sustainability direction and think about the ethical and environmental implications of the purchasing power that they have, and they have a complicated relationship with that. Not my issue. Look, the American, like the Israeli kashrut organizations, those that give the different certifications, are notoriously corrupt, and they're notoriously corrupt in many different directions. And one of them is that they don't consider these issues by and large, that ethics and law have been firmly disentangled, and that these are not valuable considerations in terms of thinking about something as kosher or not. already in the 1970s, Zalman Schachter Shalomi was pushing for eco-kashrut as a way of thinking about whether or not something is kosher or not, based on its ethical footprint. This was actually something that he got in conversation with Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was famous for asking his students, so much ink has been spilled recently about whether or not pineapples are this blessing or that blessing, and whether this is kosher or whether that's not that's kosher, but no one's asking about the kashrut of the atomic bomb, i.e. the big ethical questions are not being asked. And so Reb Zalman was really pushing for a kind of eco-kashrut in which these concerns are pushed to the forefront. And I think that the industrial complex that has to do with the way that American kosher organizations operate have prevented that. But this is clearly a deep, deep need, given how important food production is to human beings, but also how impactful it is to the environment.
Thank you so much for that answer. I have another question in the chat that I was going to move forward to. So we have a question where the person asking is, would love to hear from Kristy if you could offer a specific example of a story that you consider persuasive and powerful.
Yeah, I love that question. I would say that like an interesting conversation that has been really like persuasive and powerful is just like, how do you funnel resources in a time of crisis? I feel like that is something that I see people still like taking the most action on in social media, for better or for worse. I've seen some of the most like, dramatic mobilization in a time of crisis in the short term. And it's an interesting thing to observe, like on social media, like things will go viral, especially like, when a disaster strikes for a community, and, people are flooding it with resources and telling people where to donate. And we see it all the time on social media. But my question is like, what happens to that community when like the buzz is gone? And how do we continue to amplify their stories, and how do we continue to like know what's going on with them and like why their community was put in this vulnerable position in the first place? And so it's interesting that like the way the news cycle works, or even social media works, psychologically, like it can feel very overwhelming to try to address every crisis and disaster and, humanitarian aid issue, all at the same time. So I think it's important for people to pick maybe one or two issue areas when they do see a crisis happening or an issue that they feel really passionate about, to maybe engage deeply with it when the news cycle is engaged, but then be like, hey, maybe I should keep following up with these organizations or these communities, when the cameras are off, on building more of that long-term community base, because that's actually like what I think is going to continue to see change, no matter how persuasive maybe that like instant crisis response action may seem like.
Thank you so much for that answer, Kristy. Sophia, there's a question for you. The question is, could Sophia describe some particular actions or activities that her local group has engaged in?
Thank you. I would love to answer that question. So a lot of stuff we've been doing recently in the past year with JYCM Ann Arbor Kutza is, I don't know if everyone knows about the Shemitah year, but that's a year in Jewish tradition where 1 every 7 years we take time to rest and care for ourselves. It's kind of like a Shabbat, but a year. And we as Jewish Youth Climate Movement kind of interpreted that in a different way. We saw that as a year to, yes, take care of ourselves, but by taking care of ourselves, we must take care of our environment and take care of our world, and do all of our work with a lot of intentionality and peace to kind of provide rest during this year. So a lot of stuff we've been doing is kind of more education based. So we've been working with a lot of local temples in the Ann Arbor and Detroit area, Jewish schools, and we've had these presentations prepared for us by the JYCM education team on the leadership board that we've been able to present to different Jewish institutions targeted towards young people in this past year. And I think that's a great example of showing how our work done by the leadership board is able to be so influential, and even through the Kutzot. So yeah, we've been doing a lot of educational work. We also did just receive a grant for the Ann Arbor Kutza. That's like a youth leadership grant. Thank you. So we're able to use that money to kind of help with Hazon Detroit, which is our parent organization, their seed initiative. So we've been getting seed packets and handing that out to a lot of different people in Detroit, so they're able to kind of grow their own local gardens and also help make their own food, which is something I'm really excited about. And I'm really proud of everyone in the JYCM. Ann Arbor Kutza has been doing all this work, and I do not want to take all the credit because it's mostly all the members of the Kutza who have been able to do everything.
Thank you so much, Sophia. And I know that there is an action that's coming up. Did you want to take a minute to talk about that as well?
Of course. Thank you for bringing that up, Claire. So I believe Vicki actually talked about this earlier, and I talked about it a little bit as well. But we have our Earth Seder coming up, which is super exciting, and in kind of a more Ann Arbor spectrum, which is really cool. We'll be having one in Ann Arbor, and that'll be right outside of the Chase Bank downtown. And we've kind of decided that instead of targeting different fossil fuel organizations, we want to go straight to the financial institutions right at the top and protest towards them. And if we're able to do that through Jewish values, taking something like a Seder and adding that social justice aspect to it, that's what we're going to do. So that's how our Earth Seder came about. And those are happening throughout the country through Exodus Alliance. I don't know if everyone's heard about that, but that's another kind of Jewish environmental group. Yeah, but the one in Ann Arbor is going to be super exciting. We're still figuring out the details and all the organization, but it should look like a Seder, but in the parking lot of a Chase Bank. And we'll have some wonderful people, some great JYCM members located in the Detroit area who will be telling their climate stories and how that relates to economic justice and fighting against these large financial industries. And then at the end, we'll deliver a letter to the CEO of Chase through the bank in Ann Arbor, kind of asking for change and what we want as a Jewish community. So I hope everyone is able to join us. If you are, I believe Moss popped the registration link in the chat, which is awesome. It'll be pretty low commitment and definitely a really exciting local action we have coming up.
Thank you so much, Sophia. All right, so another question that was put in the chat is, for any of the panelists, do you ever feel overwhelmed with the work still needing to be done? If so, what do you do to push through those feelings? What gives you hope and reassurance? I would love to hear from Rabbi Ellen Bernstein and Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein first, just to make sure that I hear both of your voices as well.
I feel overwhelmed a lot. Well, I just want to say that actually I felt really inspired just by the beginning of this session today with the music of all of the probably people in their 30s that created all that beautiful music. And so it's very exciting to me that a younger generation is so proactive and taking the world into their hands. But what I do for myself is a couple of things. One, just being engaged in finding my own way, my own voice to continue to offer the message that I have to offer, which is working through Jewish texts and holidays and just continuing to do that work. Being in community is huge for me. Self-care is huge. You know, having friends to talk to, all of these kinds of things. I feel like finding support for yourself in this work is absolutely critical, and that it's impossible to do without support of community or friends.
Yes, thank you so much for that response. And Ellen, I'm wondering, in the School of Social Work, we talk often about self-care, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to share an example of any self-care practices or rituals that you have.
Sure. I mean, I walk in the woods pretty much try almost every day, and certainly on Shabbat, I go out for several hours. So that kind of thing, getting massages once in a while.
Amazing. Yeah, Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein, I'll pass the question to you.
Yes, thank you. You know, and also Ellen, what you shared about the music at the beginning from Ba'il Levine, you know, we rise. Like I would say, two things that I do for myself around self-care. One is when I feel like I'm in my head or I'm feeling overwhelmed, I just grab a guitar and I just sing for a few minutes. And sometimes I get yelled out by other people in the house just because of belting out, but that takes me out of my head and puts me in my heart a little bit. And then I would also say like morning practice and routine. Rabbi Ariel shared before about obligation, but then I also think routine and that pacing kind of helps me breathe, you know, helps me pace in different ways. And then just the other thing that helps me feel less overwhelmed is that even just looking at the screen, like the leadership, the organizations that exist, the supports that really do exist when we find the channels. And Kayla, you were speaking about eco-kashrut and the meat industry and kosher and who's thinking about this. And there are two organizations. So on this topic, if you're feeling overwhelmed, that one of them is JIFA, Jewish Initiative for Animals, that has been focused on this, Jewish Initiatives for Animals. And then the second is Shemayim, Jewish Animal Advocacy. And so, you know, we're not alone. And so as we take those breaths, but also realizing we could reach out.
You know, can I just add one other thing, which is is just finding your way with a piece of this ecological work that resonates with you. You don't have to do everything. Just finding one thing that matters, that really connects in your heart. To me, to find something that sustains you while you're doing the work is incredibly important.
I love those answers. Thank you so much. So there is one more question in the chat that I would love to pose. And then I do want to open up the space for the speakers to ask each other questions as well. And we can continue to incorporate audience questions for the time that we have left as well. So the question that is in there I'm going to pose this to any speaker who would like to respond. As audience members, what would you like for us to leave today ready to do most?
I'll start. Well, Passover's coming. And just being able to celebrate Passover from an ecological perspective is a wonderful way to engage through either the Exodus Alliance. I have a Passover Haggadah that's listed here, that's written from an ecological perspective. I think that that's a really easy way to begin. Just to begin.
Absolutely. So if anyone, yes, Ariel, please.
I would say open a book, put on glasses, and lace up your shoes. Open a book to remember that the world in which we find ourselves now isn't the world that necessarily needs to be, and that there are imaginative portals in the worlds of books to be able to create new presence. To put on new glasses, to see the dimensions of our life and the dimensions of our tradition and the dimensions of the way that we are in the world that are alive with ecological opportunities, even as we need to rethink them. And Ellen's point about the necessity of using this as a lens to rethink the holidays in the Jewish liturgical year is a great example of that. And to put on our shoes, because I think that the time for action and everything from marching in the streets to real civil disobedience is here. And there are several people on this panel who are engaged in that work.
I love that. I'm gonna bring a book with me next time I lace up my shoes and just do them all together. Yes, certainly. I love this question. I love the answer so far. And what I would love everybody in the audience to do today is to join Sophia and the JYCM Klutza in Ann Arbor and the Beth Emet Dayenu Circle, and show up at that Chase Bank in joyous song and ritual and tradition on April 20th. If you're not in Ann Arbor, find an action near you. There are 20 happening around the country to join in the weeks before, during, and after Passover. And you can find all of that on the Dayenu website and social media handles, as well as with the Exodus Alliance and JYCM. And then also, join an organization, any of the ones that have been talked about here today, communities, locally, nationally. Being together with others is also how I combat feeling overwhelmed, is taking action together. There are over 65 Dayenu circles around the country. You can join one, you can start one. And I'm here to help. We're all here to help with everybody's next steps. Thanks.
I'll jump in. So I would say definitely get involved with the Jews of Color Network. If you're listening and you identify as a Jew of color, they do amazing programming all the time. We're sending out so many resources all the time. That's where I get a lot of my information. I would say definitely, like, if people are looking for a job or career in this space, to check out the Brown Girl Green Jobs Board, and to just get involved with like amplifying mine and other BIPOC or Black, Indigenous people of color in the environmental movement's work is really valuable. I would also say being able to look up like who are the environmental justice communities in your area. There's a lot of resources on that. On like just understanding where does environmental racism potentially exist in your neighborhood, and trying to support and amplify the work of those folks. And I would say the last thing is just that, like, as was said by many people here, you don't need to start your own organization. I would just like try to amplify these organizations that need more resources and support. So definitely focus on that. And the last thing is, if you're not opposed to doing social media, it would be great to share what you learned from this session. And I encourage you to like share on your Instagram story or make a TikTok or a video today about what you learned during this conference. I think these are the ways that we start implementing what I'm talking about, being able to have especially more young people sharing this information on social media about Jewish identity, about your connection to the earth, and making this more accessible storytelling so people get to learn from this conference and it doesn't just stay in this circle.
Those are beautiful answers. All the answers you all gave so far have been incredible. I've really appreciated them. We have about 10 more minutes in this question and answer space. So I did want to open it up to see if any of you speakers have questions for one another, because I know that we were engaged in these one-on-one conversations and not everyone got to speak to each other. So even if it's just a conversation that you wanted to have or a question, I just want to open the space to that.
I had a question for Rabbi Ariel. Are you good with that? I know you talked briefly about the greenwashing, I think you said, of different Jewish traditions and holidays. Just in terms of planning this Earth Seder coming up, we try as a Jewish Youth Climate Movement to be aware and making sure everything we're doing actually has an intention and making sure we have an impact. Can you share a little bit more about that idea of greenwashing things and how me as a young person, how I can make sure that everything I'm doing, all these actions I'm planning actually do have an impact and aren't just for show?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Sophia. I'm sure your event is perfect already, but just in terms of the broader impetus behind that statement, I guess there are two separate issues with greenwashing. One is that really since the 1960s, religious traditions have been on the defensive about ecology, and that's in the wake of Lynn White's famous essay about religion as the cause of the environmental crisis. And one of the answers to that is that, well, religion really does have all the answers. Religion's great, it's perfect. We just have everything we need, and we just have to look to it, and we'll find those answers, which I think obviously belies some of the problems. And the question about kashrut and kosher certification makes it obvious how far religion can go afield from these questions. And then there's a separate question, which is, I guess there are three. There's a separate question, which is the search for analogies. How do I say stewardship in Jewish? How do I say whatever it is that I found in the New York Times and immediately try and figure out what's the Jewish way of saying that so that Jews will be excited about that? I think that's important, but there's a deeper work, which is what happens when you start to look in sort of the internal taxonomies of what Judaism has. And I think the Seder and the land ethic, and this, as Ellen draws out in her Haggadah, is not simply confirming what we find already in the contemporary environmental discourse, but it puts into a ritual grammar a different way of thinking. So leaning into the uniqueness of the Jewish approach, not just as a vocabulary for motivating people, but for thinking about how do we actually set this table in a different way, to use a metaphor for that. And the third is, look, we all know that it's important to be careful with our spending practices and be careful with the ways in which we are engaging in this kind of carbon economy. And we all know that those choices are minuscule and that there are lots of things that we want to do that are no more than virtue signaling. It's a really hard thing, but if you're asking the question, I think you'll figure your way out. If you look at your every action and try and think, is this a veneer that is applied? Or is this an essential sort of action? Is there something really deep here that actually cuts at the heart of what I'm doing? Is this going to make a difference? Then yeah, then you're in the world of every raindrop raising the ocean.
That was both a beautiful question and a beautiful response. Are there other questions that speakers have for one another, or conversations that you would like to kind of come back to?
I wanted to ask Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein. I didn't want to butcher that. I really loved what you were saying about coming from like mixed identity and trying to find like wholeness in this work. And I think it's very rooted in, this discussion of like, if you don't feel this like wholeness inside yourself, how can you really bring yourself to the work? And I just love for you to dive a bit deeper on that, because you kind of just like left it there, then we didn't get to go into it. So I want to talk more about like, what do you feel are some tools or things that people could explore to like start feeling more of that wholeness, so that way we can show up to the work and take care of ourselves? I would love if you could share some tips and ideas on that.
Hi, Kristy. Thanks for that question. Yeah, I would say one, it's the idea of wholeness. I feel like it's an ongoing journey. And some days it's a roller coaster in terms of how one, or myself, I'll just speak for myself, how, some days it's hour to hour, day to day, breath to breath. But on the note of specifically for me, what I meant by that, growing up in Muncie, New York, the ultra-Orthodox community of Muncie, New York, in a mixed race family, as a Black man with white skin, as someone who has less melanin than my other siblings, from like the time I was 3, 4, 5, people were kind of reminding me about at least my external identity of my racial identity. And so from a young age, I had to really grapple, I would say, with who I was, how people saw me. And I would also say that it's not necessarily a part of our educational structures and settings where we provide space for people to explore their identities, racial identity, gender identity, all the identities. So I think I learned through it just living, and I think also through being in relationship with people, also my elders. I definitely would say that it's also central to many cultures, including the many African cultures and also Black American culture today, that elders speak first, and reminding that of my own elders, my own family members who have lived in mixed race or interracial bodies, who have held ancestry from different corners of the earth before me. So I do think I get strength from my ancestors. I feel like they're around me very often, calling me to this moment. But it's a great question, and listen, a little bit of brokenness makes one a little bit more whole. I think also start holding the fact that we sometimes have disparate parts is very human. And the idea of trying to align that is I think, a part of this beautiful journey we call life. What about you? I mean, now that you asked, I'm curious what you're, that, because it's true, and also just what you were noting specifically in the climate justice space. Even just last week, the Jewish Youth Climate Movement, they're hosting a summit, and there was a session on the history of environmental, whether you call it environmental sustainability, environmental justice, climate justice, that arc, and just the noting that it was sort of just homogeneously European white. And just, what does that even mean? And when I was working at Chazon, Yoshi Silverstein was also on staff, who runs Mitsui Collective, Asian American Jewish leader. And so this was something that we talked about, and it's in your face a little bit. I love that JYCM has also segments and units on environmental racism and really bringing that approach as well. I'm going to stop talking though. Chris, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my answer to the question is just that, like, I've had to be on like my own path of recognizing that, like, I have my own journey, and that, like, we have to move beyond, like, we're not enough of, like, I'm not Jewish enough, I'm not brown enough, I'm not Black enough. I feel like now the conversation is moving beyond that to being like, well, how are we bringing resources back to our community, and how are we recognizing our own positionality for the identities that we hold, even when we are facing certain levels of oppression? How do we find the balance between that? And I think that that's, in my idea, the question of, like, yeah, just recognizing your privilege and like how you're leveraging it to always be mindful of, like, uplifting the voices and opportunities of those that aren't being given those same opportunities, while also being able to, like, name the gaps in the infrastructure and the need for redistribution. And as like a person of color, that's like constantly the thing I'm teetering on having a platform. And like I said before, I think all of us, it's not about like getting lost in the shame and the guilt of like what we have, but being able to like really recognize that and own that as a gift, and practicing gratitude for that. And I think that's how we find wholeness, rather than walking around with inadequacy. Because I think if we walk around with that shame, that's really what continues to divide us, because it's always like pointing fingers and not really seeing people for their humanity, but how you can extract from them, or how you can be in relationship with them, maybe not in the most interdependent way. So I think as you start exploring that and challenging your own ego, I think you start to find that. That's at least what I've found so far in my journey of all of this work.
I love having an opportunity to hear folks who weren't in conversation previously be in conversation now. That is, it's adding so many layers to this. So we have just a few minutes left in our sort of question answer conversation space. And so I do want to just sort of offer up again to the speakers, if there's one last question or comment that you have for each other, please feel free. We could also pull one more question from the audience. We'll see what comes up.
I do have a question, but I'm curious if anybody else had tip of tongue a question as well. It was actually, yeah, Rabbi Ellen, sorry, go for it.
No, I mean, you can go first.
Maybe it will be related, maybe not, but it was actually based on the conversation that you two are having, Rabbi Ellen and Rabbi Ariel, about education that's provided, the lack thereof, in different Jewish communal ecosystem, like in Jewish communal ecosystem as a whole, like whether it's in professional education, rabbinical school, even younger. So it's a question maybe for everybody, but like, what is that curriculum for the 21st century Jewish community that you think we should have as like individuals, as youth, and then also as leaders, like, or as professionals, what are those things that you think need to be integrated?
So I'll answer that. And I just wanted to actually say to you, Isaiah, I was going to ask you how you bring your sensibility around climate ecology stuff to the Jewish Federation. So I want to start out by saying that I feel like that the Jewish community is actually doing extremely well when it comes to childhood education, youth education, you know, the work that Hazon is doing. And I feel, again, like there's money in the Jewish world for that kind of Jewish education. But I don't think there is when it comes to scholarship. And, you know, I mean, that's totally my experience, that there aren't people out there. You know, we all know each other. It's a very small microcosm of people that are doing this work on that level. So it's not so much about the curriculum, because I feel like that there's all of this intersectionality that needs to happen in terms of ideas, you know, like bringing in these ideas from different ecological fields to connect with Judaism, and like how will Jews think about just different kinds of ecological ideas in all kinds of realms. I'm sorry I can't be more specific, but I just feel like there's a million, you know, things to say about economics and law and a relationship to nature and just a million ways. And, you know, someone needs to be paid to like think about this and get it going in different, you know, and different schools need to commit to it. And the federations need to commit to it, right? I mean, just really quickly, I've talked with some of the students here about how to integrate ecological thinking into the curriculum of the social work school, and just the whole piece of climate anxiety being, you know, something that so many people are feeling, and it's only going to be getting worse. And how can social work students bring this into their practices as therapists? And also, how can they help Jewish communities get hip, you know, synagogues, that this is going to be a real issue that they need to be dealing with all the time, you know? So anyway, it's a quick answer.
I'd love to share something too. I just loved hearing you, Rabbi Ellen, like bring up the intersections, like with climate and ecological issues and every other issue, right? And like, I think as Jews, we love to tackle the big issues, right? With all those intersections. And I've gotten to see something that I think it's worth lifting up, so everybody has a window into this, at rabbinical schools, at seminaries right now. We're seeing a lot of leadership come from students themselves who are saying, this is really important to us, right? We're growing up, we're coming of age, we want to be leaders who are ready to address the climate crisis. There's now sort of groups, Dayenu circles forming at 5 different seminaries, at JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, at Hebrew Union College, at Hebrew College, at Ziegler, and at YCT, Yeshivat Chovevei Torah. And this is like led by students with support of professors. And I think we're just starting to see that. And in the coming years, we'll really see that grow. So looking to students themselves, and I think JCLP, this event here today, is an example of that, the leadership coming from the students.
So I would love for all of you to continue speaking for many, many more hours than what we have allotted. So, unfortunately, we are going to wrap up this portion, and I'm going to go ahead and move on to our concluding thoughts for today. So we have come to the end of our event for today. And before we sign off, I would like to take a moment to thank the folks who made today happen. So first, we want to share our gratitude with the sponsors for today's event: Jean and Samuel Frankel Center for Jewish Studies, University of Michigan School of Social Work Student Union, School of Social Work, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Trotter Multicultural Center, University of Michigan Hillel, Beth Israel Congregation, Temple Beth Emeth, Ann Arbor Reconstructionist Synagogue, the Amir Project, Repair the World, University of Michigan Department of American Culture, The Well, University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability, and the Jewish Communal Leadership Program. Next, I just want to give a huge thank you again to all of our speakers who are here today. Kristy Drutman, Sophia Rich, Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein, Rabbi Ellen Bernstein, Vicki Kaplan, and Dr. Rabbi Ariel Mayse. Thank you as well to Alice Mishkin, Paige Walker, Carla Goldman, and first-year JCLP cohort for their support in planning this event. And finally, thank you to you, our audience, for taking time out of your weekend to learn with us today. Just as a reminder, you can continue your learning from today with the resource list in your PDF programs. We will send this to you in a follow-up email, as well as a feedback form to share your thoughts with us from today. This is also available in the chat now. Thank you all again. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone, and goodbye.